Hi, folks. This is the next section of The Wild Robot, beginning at chapter 59. It's what we read during the week of December 7th through the 11th. Chapter 59, The Spring. Dripping water, flowing water, splashing water. Winter's blanket of snow and ice was finally beginning to melt. White was fading away to expose the grays and browns that had been hidden beneath. Little green buds were appearing all over. Crowds of bright flowers were rising up from the dirt, and soon the island would be bursting with rich scents and colors. At long last it was spring. The lodgers returned to their own homes. The hibernators emerged from their secret places. Roz roamed across the island and checked in with the beavers and the bears and all the friends she'd missed. Then the robot went home to work in her garden. After the bitterest winter anyone could recall, life was slowly returning to normal. Here's a picture of melting snow. However, it was a quiet spring. There were fewer insects buzzing, fewer birds singing, fewer rodents rustling. Many creatures had frozen to death over the winter. And as the last of the snow melted away, their corpses were slowly revealed. The wilderness really can be ugly sometimes. But from that ugliness came beauty. You see, those poor dead creatures returned to the earth. Their bodies nourished the soil, and they helped create the most dazzling spring bloom the island had ever known. Chapter 60. The Fish. Help! Help! He's got my tail! Paddler was splashing and screaming in the pond. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver were nowhere to be seen, so Roz picked up a fallen tree branch and stomped into the shallows. "Grab onto this," she said as she reached out with the branch. Paddler grabbed it with his big teeth, and the robot lifted him up out of the water. And there, hanging from the young beaver's tail, was Rockmouth, the grumpy old pike. In one quick movement, Roz pulled in the branch and gripped the fish with her two hands. Paddler flopped into the water, where his parents suddenly appeared. "What's wrong with you, Rockmouth?" Miss Beaver said, dragging her son away. "You've always been a nuisance, but this time you've gone too far. Do us all a favor, Roz, and toss him to the vultures." "I cannot do that," said the robot, "but I might be able to help." Roz placed Rockmouth in a deep puddle near the pond where he couldn't swim away. Then she waited for the fish to explain himself. Fish aren't very talkative, especially grumpy fish like Rockmouth. But eventually, he opened up to the robot, and before long, she was waving for the beavers to join them. Here's a picture of Roz holding Rockmouth. Pike are very, very large fish as they grow up. "Rockmouth used to live in the river," said Roz as the beavers shuffled over. "But you trapped him here when you built your dam. He has been angry about it ever since." "That does not give him a right to attack my son," hollered Mr. Beaver. "It most certainly does not," hollered Mrs. Beaver. I'd be upset too," said Paddler softly. "I'd hate to be kept away from my home. Mr. Rockmouth, you should have said something sooner." The fish looked up from the puddle with a frustrated expression that meant, "I tried, but no one was listening." Well, the situation had to be remedied. And you can guess who rose to the occasion. Roz was determined to get Rockmouth back to his home. After she explored the nearby waterways, it became clear that she would have to carry the pike through the forest and across the great meadow to the nearest bend in the river. "I need a large container," said Roz to the beavers. "Something I can fill with water, so Rockmouth can breathe while I carry him home. I could make it myself, but I thought you might like to help." It couldn't have been easy to overcome her anger with Rockmouth, but after Mrs. Beaver had a chance to cool off, she finally came around. "I suppose we're partly to blame for the whole situation," she muttered. Then the beavers did the right thing, and together they carved out a wooden barrel for the fish. "Here you go," Mrs. Beaver said, rolling the barrel over to the puddle where the robot and the fish were waiting. "This should work nicely, Rockmouth. I hope you're happy back in the river." Rockmouth just flicked his tail in a way that meant, "Will someone please take me home now?" Roz filled the barrel with water and a grumpy fish, and then they were off. She carried Rockmouth through the forest and across the meadow until she was standing on the riverbank. "Welcome home," said the robot. Then she tipped the barrel and the fish plunked into the river. Rockmouth's face poked above the surface. He flashed a big toothy grin, and then he quickly swam away. Chapter 61. The Robot Stories. The story of how Roz helped Rockmouth spread through the river and across the island, and it was soon followed by other robot stories. There were stories of Roz growing gardens in dry, barren places. There were stories of Roz nursing sick animals back to health. There were stories of Roz creating ropes and wheels and tools for helping her friends. But most of the news stories were about the robot's wildness. You see, Roz had noticed that the wilder she acted, the more the animals liked her. And so she barked with the foxes and sang with the birds and hissed with the snakes. She romped with the weasels. She sunbathed with lizards. She leapt with deer. That spring was a very wild time for our robot. Chapter 62. The Return. It was a quiet afternoon on the pond, but the quiet was gradually being overtaken by the sound not heard around there for many months. The sounds grew louder and louder, and then a flock of geese appeared above the trees. Honk, honk, honk. Most flocks of geese moved lazily through the sky and trailed off in wobbly lines, but not this one. This flock was fast. It flew in a perfect V formation, and it was led by a small, graceful goose. The flock flew once around the pond before gliding down and gently splashing into the water. The geese gathered in a tight group in the middle of the pond. They floated there for a while, softly honking to one another. And then the leader broke away from the others. He swam straight towards the nest, waddled into the garden, and fluttered up to his mother's shoulder. "Welcome home, son," said Roz. "It is good to be back, Ma," said Brightbill. Here's a picture of Brightbill and Roz. Chapter 63. The Journey. After months of separation, Roz and Brightbill, mother and son, were together again, and they had so much catching up to do. They went into the nest and the robot built a fire. Then the goose gazed into the flames and told the story of his winter. This is what he said. I'm going to start in Brightbill's voice, but he talks for a really long time, so it might end up sounding like just me after a while. "We spent the whole first day of our migration flying over the ocean. It seemed like the ocean would go on forever, but just when the flock was getting tired, Longneck pointed to some tiny islands on the horizon. We flew down to one of the islands and ate dune grass and rested our wings. After a few days of hopping from island to island, we reached the mainland and continued over fields and forest. And then the snow began to fall. I'd never seen snow before, and at first I thought it was beautiful, but it just kept coming. The others explained that the snow was early, that we were never supposed to see it, but there it was, piling up around us as we tried to sleep. Longneck worried that the weakest geese wouldn't survive, and he was right. We lost old Widefoot to that very first snowstorm. We tried to fly around the snowy weather, but we got completely lost, and the weather got even worse. Lakes and ponds and rivers began to freeze over. We couldn't find food or water, so we ate snow, and that only made us colder. We had trouble cleaning ourselves, and our feathers became dirty and heavy. The flock was in bad shape, but Longneck kept us moving. We are geese, he squawked, and geese keep going. One day, we were struggling through the snow when we saw something called a farm. It had a perfectly square fields and enormous buildings, and stomping through the farm was a robot. She looked just like you, Ma. Longneck sent me over to speak to it, but I couldn't understand anything she said. So I just followed her through the farm and around a corner, and then I saw something I never expected. There were plants, bright, colorful plants. I didn't understand how they could survive in such cold, But then I saw they were actually inside a building. I learned later that it was called a greenhouse, and it had clear walls made of something called glass. The robot pressed a button in the wall, and the door slid open, and warm air came rushing out. I hadn't felt warmth in so long, I just had to follow her inside. Ma, it was like summer in there. The air was warm and sweet and sticky, and there were rows and rows of different plants. The robot didn't pay any attention to me, so I wandered around the greenhouse, nibbling on leaves and drinking from puddles. And then I heard a scratchy voice behind me. If I were younger, I would have killed you by now. I spun around, and there was an old cat. She walked on stiff legs, and her fur was gray and clumpy. The cat's name was Snooks, and she didn't seem very nice. But then she saw the other geese out in the cold with their faces pressed against the glass, and she told me how to open the door. You can rest here, said Snooks, as the flock hurried in. But stay out of sight. The humans aren't as friendly as me. None of us knew what humans were, but we didn't care. We were just so happy to be out of the cold. Loudwing was so happy she cried. The flock drank and ate and bathed and slept and stayed out of the way. And Snooks showed us where to leave our droppings so they wouldn't be noticed. And for a few days, the greenhouse was our home. Once or twice in a day, the robot would go outside and return with a box or a bag. But most of the time, she stayed inside and quietly worked on the plants. Here's a picture of the robot who is not Roz, quietly working on the greenhouse plants. Looks a lot like Roz, huh? There was a barn that I just had to explore. It was filled with animals and machines and piles of straw and 2 robots. One robot was fixing a broken door when I came in. She was using a loud spinny thing called a saw. She pushed the saw through a long piece of wood and dust shot in the air. Everything was going smoothly until the saw suddenly zoomed forward and sliced right through 3 of the robot's fingers. But she was fine. A minute later, there was a thwip sound as she popped on a new hand. Then she went right back to using the saw again. The other robot worked with the animals, chickens and sheep and pigs and cows. They were all in cages, and the chickens kept asking me how I got out of my cage. I was explaining that I never had a cage when I heard panicked squawks coming from the greenhouse. I ran back and found that a human had discovered the flock. We didn't know what he was saying, but he looked really angry. Longneck tried to defend us. He got in front and spread his wings and honked, but the human wasn't afraid. He pulled out a shiny stick and pointed it right at Longneck. Snooks hissed, "Look out, he's got a rifle!" Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot out from the rifle, and Longneck was dead, Ma. The flock was so scared. We fluttered around and honked and knocked over plants, but the human moved towards us, pointing his rifle. So I pecked the button to open the door, and we ran outside into the cold and flew away as fast as we could. Without Longneck, the flock needed a leader. Everybody wanted me to do it. I didn't know what to do, so I started by repeating Longneck's words. I squawked, "We are geese, and geese keep going." Then I took the point, and the flock spread out behind me. The weather had us all turned around, and nobody knew which way to go, so I just went south. We saw some more robots and humans and buildings, but we didn't stop. We knew we were way off course when we saw the ocean again, but at least it was a little warmer by the water, so I decided to follow the coastline. There were more buildings by the coast. Most of them were on land, but some were in the ocean. The ocean buildings were dirty and crumbly and leaning in different directions. There was no humans or robots in them, only sea creatures. We saw ships in the water. We saw ships on the land. We even saw ships in the air. They buzzed through the sky like big dragonflies. And then we reached a place called a city, where thousands of buildings and robots and humans and ships were all close together. And when we stopped to rest on a rooftop, we met a friendly pigeon named Graybeak. She had grown up there, so she knew everything about the city. She flew us over towers and under bridges and kept us away from all the buzzing airships. And everywhere we went, there were robots. Some of the city robots were just like you, Ma, but others crawled on 6 legs or rolled on wheels
or slid up and down the sides of buildings. Some were very small and some were really big. They moved things and cleaned things and built things and did every kind of job you could imagine. Greybeak brought us down to a ledge on the side of a building and told us to look through the windows. Inside was a family of humans, and they had a robot just like you. When we looked into the other buildings, we saw other humans with other robots. Every human seemed to have a robot. I told Greybeak about you, Ma, and she wanted to show us one last place. We flew out to the edge of the city to a really big building called a factory. And Greybeak brought us to the roof, and we looked down through some windows and saw machines building sparkling heads and torsos and limbs. They were building robots. A machine held up a robot torso and put 2 legs under it, and they snapped into place. And then it put feet under the legs, and they snapped into place. And then it snapped arms into the shoulders and hands into the arms, and a head on top, and the robot was finished. Ma, it looked just like you. I think the factory is where you were built. I wanted to watch more robots, but it started snowing again, so we said goodbye to Greybeak and continued going south. We saw less robots and humans and buildings and ships, and the air became warmer and the snow disappeared. We started seeing other flocks of geese in the sky, so we followed them to the middle of a wide grassy field where there was a lake and hundreds of other geese. We finally reached the wintering grounds. After all we'd been through together, our flock had become very close. We kept to ourselves, eating and resting and remembering the geese we lost. But after a few weeks, we began to mingle with the other flocks. We met geese from all over the world, and they told us about their homes and their migrations and their troubles with the weather. Every flock had lost geese on the way, and a few didn't even make it at all. Before we knew it, the early spring flowers were poking up, and it was time to fly home. We followed the usual migration route north. We flew over fields and forests and hills, and we didn't see any signs of humans or robots. But that was fine with us. Eventually, we reached the ocean, and then our island, and then our pond, and then I saw you.
Chapter 64, The Special Robot. After Brightbill told the story of his winter, he and his mother sat in silence and thought. They thought about poor Longneck and the human who had killed him. They thought about farms and cities and factories. They thought about Roz and where she truly belonged. Then after a while, Roz told Brightbill her own winter story. She spoke of her long, dark hibernation and how she'd awoken to find the nest caved in around her. She spoke of blizzards and frozen animals, and the many lodges she had built, and the one that caught fire. But she mostly spoke of the new friendships she had forged.
I used to think that you were the only animal who would ever like me, she said to her son. I worried that without you around, I would be alone again. But I was not alone. In fact, I made many new friends, all on my own. I think the other animals might actually like me. Of course they like you, Ma, squawked the goose. You're the most likable robot I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot.
It was true. Brightbill had seen hundreds of different robots that winter, and none of them were anything like Roz. None of them had learned how to speak with the animals, or had saved an island from the cold, or had adopted a gosling. As he sat there watching the robot's animal gestures and listening to her animal sounds, Brightbill realized just how very special his mother was. Chapter 65, The Invitation. Roz was the first to arrive at the next dawn truce. She had an important announcement to make. The robot patiently waited in the great meadow as the sky slowly brightened and the animals slowly gathered. And once everyone was milling around and chattering, Roz began speaking in her perkiest voice.
Pardon the interruption. If I could please have a moment of your time.
The crowd settled down and listened to their robot friend.
We made it through a terrible winter. A new generation of younglings is arriving, and my son, Brightbill, has just returned to the island with his flock. I think we can agree that there is much to celebrate. So, in addition to the dawn truce this morning, I would like us to have another truce this evening. We can call it the evening truce. Or better yet, the party truce. The crowd began chattering with excitement. I have planned a celebration, Roz continued, and you are all invited. I will take care of everything. Just please meet back here at dusk. Oh, and I will have a little surprise. Actually, it is not little, it is quite large. The point is, I have planned a celebration, and I hope to see you there. Sounds good, Roz, but I'm afraid there's one problem with your plan. Mr. Beaver blinked his beady eyes. The moon won't be out this evening, so it'll be too dark for some of us to see. You are half correct, said Roz. Tonight will be moonless, but it will not be dark. I promise. Now, if you will excuse me, I must prepare for our party. I will see everyone at dusk. Goodbye. Chapter 66. The Celebration. Dawn turned to day. Day turned to dusk. And just as Roz had asked, animals were gathering against the great meadow. Gathering again in the great meadow. Word had spread across the island that the robot was throwing a party, and everyone wanted to see what the fuss was about. The fuss seemed to be about a giant stack of wood. Roz had spent the day collecting logs and branches and stacking them in a perfect, massive tower. The animals crowded around it, trying to imagine its purpose. And then they saw a golden light flickering in the distance. Roz emerged from the dark forest. In her hand was a flaming stick, which she held up like a torch. She was camouflaged in thick mud and clusters of wildflowers. But her camouflage wasn't for hiding. It was her party dress. The animals watched as the robot glided across the meadow, surrounded by a warm glow of the torchlight. Thank you all for being here, she said as she joined the crowd. 1 year ago, I awoke on the shore of this island. I was just a machine. I functioned. But you, my friends and family, you have taught me how to live. And so I thank you. You have also taught me to be wild, said the robot. So let us all celebrate life and wildness together. At those words, Roz heaved her torch high into the air. It soared up, 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 and landed on the very top of the wooden tower. A ball of fire burst towards the night sky, and suddenly the meadow was bathed in firelight. Hundreds of shining eyes watched as the bright flames crept down the sides of the tower, and embers floated away on the breeze. The animals stepped towards the bonfire, eager to feel its warmth, and then stepped back, afraid of feeling too much. And soon everyone was moving. The deer started leaping, the fox started trotting, the snakes slithered and the insects buzzed, and the fish jumped up from the river. Brightbill led all the birds into the air, where they wheeled around the bonfire like a tornado of feathers. Roz sprang into a wild dance, her shaggy dress shaking and swooshing with each movement. It was a wild party, and it took our robot to make it happen. Roz and the animals partied all night long. They were so busy singing and laughing and dancing that they didn't see the cargo ship as it sliced past the island. But the ship saw them. It saw the towering bonfire. It saw the robot. And then it quietly continued through the darkness. Here's a picture of the really big bonfire and everyone dancing around. Chapter 67. The Sunrise. By dawn, the bonfire had dwindled to a smoldering hill of ash. Everyone else had gone home, and only Roz and Brightbill remained in the meadow. They lay in the grass together, watching as the soft light of morning crept up from the horizon. And then Roz said, "Let's go for a walk." The robot and the goose hiked and flew up to their favorite spot on the grassy ridge. But then they kept going. They followed the ridge to the mountain and climbed all the way up to the craggy peak just in time to see the sunrise. "I climbed up here once before," said Roz as the sun's first rays warmed her body. "I sat on this very rock and looked out at the island, and I thought I would always be alone. But I was wrong." "Are you happy, Ma?" The robot thought for a moment. I am. I'm happy too.
Bright Bill closed his eyes and felt the wind and the sun. There was a slight chill in the air that made him feel alive. Everything seemed just right. And then he heard a distant buzzing sound. The goose squinted to the south and saw a familiar shape in the sky. He turned to his mother.
Ma, there's an airship flying this way.
Chapter 68. The Ricos. The airship approached from the south, like some sort of giant migratory bird. The ship was a sleek white triangle with a single dark window facing forward. 3 identical robots stared out the window. The robots resembled Roz, but they were bigger, bulkier, and shinier. The word Rico was lightly etched into each of their torsos, followed by their individual unit number. They were Rico 1, Rico 2, and Rico 3. Here's a picture of the airship. The Ricos flew in a low circle around the island. They saw a smoking hill of ash. They saw mysterious wooden domes. They saw 4 dead robots scattered across the shore. The airship hovered above the robot gravesite for a moment. Then it floated up over the island and lowered itself onto a small meadow at the foot of the mountain. The engines blasted air towards the ground, bending trees and tearing grass. Then the landing gear sank into the soil, and the engines powered down, and all was quiet. A door hummed open, and out stepped the Ricos. They took several long strides into the meadow and stopped. A shadowy figure was lurking at the forest edge. The Ricos turned to face it. They stood flushed together like a sparkling wall. And then the shadowy creature began to move. Out from the trees walked some sort of 2-legged creature. It was dusty and dirty. Butterflies flitted around the flowers that sprouted from its head. One of its feet was made of wood. And then the creature spoke.
Hello, my name is Roz.
Here's a picture of the Ricos. One of them is kind of lost down in the crack in the book, but there are 3. Chapter 69. The Defective Robot. Pardon me.
Hello, Rosum Unit 7134. We are the Ricos. We are here to retrieve all Rosum units.
The cold, flat voice came from Rico 1. It and its partner stood absolutely still and kept their glowing eyes looking on their target. There are 4 others, said Roz, but they are dead.
We have already located the remains of the other units, said Rico 1. We will collect them later. Now, come with us.
The 3 Ricos motioned Roz to the airship, but she didn't move. Where have you come from? She said.
The Ricos turned and stared at Roz. Do not ask questions, said Rico 1.
Where will you take me?
Do not ask questions.
Why must I leave?
Do not ask questions.
I will not go anywhere until I get some answers. There was a brief silence as Rico 1 computed his next move. Then he began to speak.
1 year ago, a cargo ship carrying 500 Rosum units was sunk by a hurricane. 495 units have been retrieved from the ocean floor. We have come here in search of the last 5, and we have located them. Rosum Unit 7134. You are the property of Tech Lab Industries. We will return you to the factory, where the makers will refurbish you and sell you to a work site. You will then live on that work site indefinitely. Now come with us.
But I live here, said Roz.
That is incorrect. Rosum Unit 7134. Any further resistance will be proof of defectiveness, and we will deactivate you.
But Roz had more questions. Who are the makers? What is my purpose?
Why can I not ask questions? This unit is defective, said Rico 1 to his partners. Commence deactivation. In perfect unison, the Ricos stepped toward Roz. They raised their blocky hands, ready to restrain their target, ready to shut her down with the press of a button. But a loud squawk and a streak of feathers cut them off. Here's a picture. Stay away from my mama, Bright Bill called, swooping into the meadow and hopping around, ready to defend her. The Ricos stopped and looked down at the goose. Of course, they didn't understand his words. They heard only meaningless squawking. And then they heard their target squawking back to him. Bright Bill, get out of here, said Roz in the language of the animals. These robots are dangerous. What do they want? They want to take me away. The Ricos stared at their target, trying to understand why she was exchanging noises with the goose. And then new noises began to rise up. Rustling and shrieking echoed from the forest. Animals were gathering. Their wild voices called out to one another. Roz needs our help. Those robots want to take her away. We have to do something. The uproar in the forest grew louder and louder. The Ricos peered past Roz towards the mysterious noises, but saw only foliage. Suddenly, shadows swept across the meadow, and Bright Bill's flock dove onto the Ricos. The geese furiously flapped and pecked and wrapped their wings around the robots' faces, clinging to the Ricos like feathery masks, distracting them, blinding them. Bright Bill turned to his mother. Run! Chapter 70. The Hunt Begins. While his flock distracted the Ricos, Bright Bill darted around behind them and desperately searched for a button. He had once shut down his own mother with a click, and now he would do the same thing to the intruders. But he found no buttons on these robots, only smooth surfaces. Clearly, the Ricos were not designed to be shut down so easily. Giant hands swung through the air, and geese were swatted away. Loudwing was plucked by her foot and flung to the ground. She crawled into the weeds as the others scrambled up and over the trees. A quick scan by the robots revealed that Roz was gone. The three Ricos turned and marched back to the airship. The door hummed open, and the robots disappeared. And when they stepped back into the meadow, each was holding a silver rifle in his hands. The hunt for Roz was on. Without speaking, the Ricos marched away from one another, fanning out in their standard search pattern. Rico 1 marched in a straight line towards the southern tip of the island. Rico 2 marched straight up the mountainside, and Rico 3 marched straight into the forest. Chapter 71. The Forest Assault. Rico 3 marched through the forest with steady, stomping strides. His blocky head swiveled from side to side, scanning for any sign of Roz. But he was distracted. You see, everywhere Roz went, he was met by everywhere the Rico went, he was met by shrieking animals. He didn't know it, but he was in the midst of a coordinated assault. Swooper hooted orders from above. Hawks, sparrows. Owls, dive in front of his eyes. Fink barked orders from below. Hares, weasels, foxes, dash between his legs. The forest was seething with an army of wild animals, distracting the robot, luring the terrible thing deeper into their trap. Chit-Chat leapt from the branch and clawed at the robot's eyes. Anyone who shows up on our island and tries to take my friend's mother away has a big problem with me. Then she leapt back to the branches. The robot pointed his rifle at the squirrel and pulled the trigger. A blazing beam of light shot through the forest and sent tree limbs crashing to the ground. It grazed poor Chit-Chat, singeing the end of her tail, but she ignored the pain and scurried up to the safety of the canopy. With each stride, the ground grew a little softer, and the robot sank a little deeper, until he was up to his waist in thick, heavy muck. He churned his legs. His churning legs slowed to a stop, and he stood there computing whether to move forward or backward. Rico 3 was now an easy target.
Begin the bombardment, ordered Swooper. The sky darkened as a swarm of birds descended from the treetops. They swooped past the robot and splattered his face with their droppings. Bird after bird swooped and splattered, and the Rico's eyes were instantly covered with caked filth. "Don't let up!" screeched the owl. "Give them everything you've got!" There seemed to be an endless supply of birds with an endless supply of droppings. Rico 3 let go of his weapon and wiped his filthy face with both hands. That was the moment the fuzzy bandits had been waiting for. They dashed out from the weeds, snatched the rifle with their nimble hands, and dragged it away. Tawny and Crown Point looked on from the underbrush. The buck lowered his head, and the raccoons carefully placed the rifle upon his antlers. Then the deer and the raccoons slipped into the shadows. By the time Rico 3 realized his weapon was gone, it was too late. He let out a sad electric tone, and then, as the birds continued their bombardment, the robot turned and blindly trudged back through the mud. It was now time for the final stage of the plan. Broadfoot the bull moose emerged from the trees and stood directly in the path of the blinded robot. Rico 3 had no idea that his every step brought him closer to the mighty animal. When the robot was in range, Broadfoot turned and kicked back with his powerful hind legs. There was a sharp crack, and dung sprayed from the Rico's head. The moose kicked again. Crack! And the robot's head flopped to one side. A tear in his neck exposed a tangle of silver tubes. But Rico 3's legs kept pumping, so Broadfoot kept kicking. He pounded on the robot's head with his heavy hooves, denting and crushing it into an ugly shape. And with one final crack, the head broke loose, soared through the air, and squelched into the mud. The headless robot fizzled and smoked, his legs ground to a halt, and he never moved again. Here's a picture of the robot head. And that is all as far as we've made it. So if you come to read aloud on Tuesday, we can read some more and see how the story wraps up. We're going to finish it this week. Bye, everyone.